There is a mountain in northern Greece that, on certain mornings, disappears. The clouds gather around its peak so completely, so deliberately, that the summit simply ceases to exist for those standing below. The slopes remain, the forests remain, but the top, the very crown of Mount Olympus, is swallowed whole by the sky. And for a moment, if you are still enough and quiet enough, you can almost understand why the ancient Greeks looked up at that vanishing point and thought, something lives up there, something extraordinary, something that does not wish to be seen by ordinary eyes. That instinct, that profound, searching human instinct to place greatness above us, gave birth to one of the most enduring imaginative achievements in the history of our species. Not a philosophy, not a science, something older and stranger and far more persistent than either. A family, a divine, feuding, passionate, occasionally catastrophic family of gods who looked remarkably like us, wanted exactly what we want, suffered as we suffer, and loved with the same breathtaking recklessness with which we have always loved. They were called the Olympians. And though the civilization that worshipped them has been dust for 2,000 years, they have never, not for a single century, gone away. We live, even now, inside the world they shaped. Every week, without thinking, we name our days after celestial bodies that the Greeks and Romans charged with divine personality. We walk into museums and find them staring back at us from marble, cool-eyed and perfect, frozen in mid-gesture for millennia. We watch films in which their stories are retold, again and again, because no one has yet found a better template for exploring what it means to be powerful and flawed at the same time. We speak words every single day. Words like music, chaos, panic, narcissism, tantalize, mentor, that were born directly from their myths. The Greek gods are not history in the way that a fallen empire is history. They are something more stubborn than that. They are vocabulary. They are the deep grammar of Western imagination. But to understand what that truly means, we must go back, not to textbooks, not to footnotes. We must go back to the fire. Imagine the Mediterranean world 3,000 years ago. The sea is impossible blue. The olive trees are silver in the afternoon light. And the people, farmers, sailors, soldiers, mothers, merchants, poets, are surrounded on all sides by forces they cannot control. Drought comes without warning. Ships vanish in storms that rise in an afternoon. War arrives and does not explain itself. Children are born and children are lost. The stars wheel overhead in patterns so precise they feel intentional, and the seasons turn with a rhythm so reliable it seems enforced by something unseen. Into this world, the Greeks did not ask merely what was happening. They asked who was responsible, and so they built them. 12 of them, reigning from the impossible summit of Olympus, each one a sovereign of some essential domain of existence. One for the sky and the authority that comes from above. One for the sea and all its terrifying freedom. One for wisdom, sharp and gray-eyed and undeceived. One for love, which has always been more dangerous than any war. One for death's borderlands. One for the harvest that decides whether you eat or starve through winter. One for the forge and the strange necessary dignity of making things with your hands. Each god was not simply a personality. Each god was an answer, a way of saying, this part of the world has a nature, has a will, has moods you would be wise to understand, and wiser still to respect. What followed, the myths, the temples, the rituals, the epics, the tragedies, was not superstition, or rather, it was not only superstition, it was an entire civilization's attempt to have an honest conversation with the universe, to look at suffering and say, there is meaning in this, to look at beauty and say, there is a source of this, to look at the staggering, baffling complexity of human nature, our capacity for both tenderness and violence, for both brilliance and stupidity, and say, of course, we are made in the image of gods who contain all of it too. The 12 Olympians are not relics, they are mirrors, ancient ones. A little clouded now, perhaps, but tilt them at the right angle, and you will find yourself looking back. Let us begin at the top. Let us begin, as all things in the Greek world began, with the sky. Zeus, Lord of Thunder, Father of gods, Sovereign of the sky. There is a particular quality to the silence before a thunderstorm. Anyone who has stood in an open field and watched a summer sky darken will know it. The air becomes very still. Birds vanish. The light turns a color that has no proper name, not quite green, not quite gold, and the pressure of the atmosphere changes in some way that the body registers before the mind catches up. You become, in that moment, acutely aware that you are very small, that something is coming that was not invited and cannot be turned back. The ancient Greeks felt that silence too, and unlike us, they knew exactly what it meant. It meant he was thinking. His name, in its oldest roots, is simply the word for sky, not a god of the sky itself, personified and given intention. Dias, the Proto-Indo-European linguists call the root, the bright one, the shining one, the daylight made sovereign. The Romans would call him Jupiter. The Norse would find the same archetype in Odin. The impulse is so ancient and so widespread that scholars believe it predates civilization itself. This stubborn human conviction that whatever governs from above must be the highest authority of all. That altitude is power. That the thing which can strike down from the heavens without being struck back is, by definition, in charge. But the Zeus of Greek mythology is far more interesting than a mere symbol of dominance. He is something the other sky gods of the ancient world rarely managed to be. He is complicated. To understand Zeus fully, you must first understand what he came from. Before the Olympians, before the gods as the Greeks knew them, there was an older generation, the Titans. Vast, primordial beings who had ruled the cosmos in an age so remote, it barely has a shape. And at the head of those Titans sat Kronos, Zeus's father, powerful, ancient, and consumed by a single paralyzing fear. A prophecy had told Kronos that one of his own children would rise up and overthrow him, just as he had once overthrown his own father. And so Kronos did what tyrants across all of human history have done. When confronted with a fear they cannot reason their way out of, he attempted to eliminate the threat entirely. Every child that his wife Rhea bore, Kronos swallowed whole, taking them inside himself where they could not grow, could not challenge, could not become. 5 children disappeared this way. 5 times Rhea handed her newborn to her husband and watched it vanish. The 6th time, she refused. She wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and gave it to Kronos instead, and the great Titan, too certain perhaps, in his own power to look closely, swallowed the decoy without question. The real child, hidden away on the island of Crete, was given to the care of nymphs and a divine goat named Amalthea, and raised in a cave on honey and goat's milk, while the world above went on, unsuspecting, under his father's reign. That child was Zeus. What the Greeks understood in telling this story is something we still wrestle with, that the very act of suppression creates what it fears, that Kronos, in trying so desperately to prevent a revolution, guaranteed one. He swallowed his children, and in doing so swallowed his own future, because the child he could not catch grew up in the wilderness, grew up outside the system of power, grew up without the corruption that comfort brings, and became precisely the thing Kronos had most dreaded. When Zeus was grown, he returned. He gave Kronos an emetic, a divine purge, and out came the 5 swallowed siblings, whole and divine and furious: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. Together they waged a war against the Titans that lasted, the myths tell us, 10 years. 10 years of cosmic violence that shook the earth and rattled the stars. And at the end of it, Zeus stood victorious. The old order was cast down into Tartarus, and the world was remade. He took the sky. He gave the sea to Poseidon. He gave the underworld to Hades, and from the summit of Olympus, Zeus began the long, complicated, frequently stormy business of ruling everything in between. Now, if Zeus were merely a conqueror, the stories would have stopped there. Victory is a fine ending, but it is a terrible beginning for a character worth following. What makes Zeus endure? What makes him genuinely fascinating across 3,000 years of storytelling is that he is a ruler who is never entirely in control. Not of the world, not of the other gods, and most remarkably of all, not of himself. He is, by any measure, the most powerful being in Greek mythology. His thunderbolt, the weapon forged for him by the Cyclopes in gratitude for his freeing them from Tartarus, is a force nothing in creation can withstand. Even the other Olympians, even the Titans, cannot survive a direct strike. When Zeus is truly angry, mountains shake. When he nods his great head, Olympus trembles with the affirmation. And yet, he is deceived regularly by his wife Hera. He is occasionally bound, in certain myths, by the other gods conspiring against him. He is moved, genuinely, helplessly moved, by the suffering of mortals he has come to love. He intervenes in wars he has promised to stay out of. On behalf of heroes he cannot quite bring himself to watch die. He weeps, in Homer, golden tears, when his mortal son Sarpedon falls on the plains of Troy. The most powerful being in the universe sits on his golden throne and weeps, because power has never once in any world been a reliable protection against grief. This is the genius of what the Greeks built. Their king of gods is not omnipotent in the cold, abstract way of a theological absolute. He is omnipotent, the way a very powerful human is omnipotent, capable of extraordinary things, constrained by extraordinary things, and perpetually surprised by the gap between the two. His loves are famous, and famously complicated. Zeus pursued mortals and immortals alike with a relentlessness that the myths record without much apology. It was, in its ancient context, an expression of divine abundance, of life force overflowing its container. He came to Danae as golden rain, to Europa as a beautiful white bull, so gentle she climbed upon his back before understanding where she was being taken, to Leda as a swan, to Ganymede, the most beautiful of mortals, in the form of an eagle, carrying the boy to Olympus, to serve as cupbearer to the gods forever. These stories are not comfortable, read through a modern lens, and we need not pretend they are. But within them, if you look carefully, is something the Greeks were genuinely trying to articulate. The idea that the divine reaches down into the mortal world constantly, that the boundary between human and God is always being crossed, always being blurred, and that the offspring of those crossings, Heracles, Perseus, Minos, Helen of Troy herself, are the beings who make history happen. The demigods, the heroes, the ones who stand at the exact point where the human and the superhuman meet and strike sparks. Zeus was not just a ruler. He was, in a very literal mythological sense, the source of history. Every hero's lineage traces back, eventually, to that high mountain. His relationship with Hera is one of the great marriages in all of world mythology. Great, not in the sense of happy, but in the sense of operatic. Hera is his queen and his equal and his most formidable opponent, and the tension between them runs through the myths like a live wire. She punishes his lovers. He dismisses her concerns. She schemes with extraordinary patience and intelligence. He responds with the blunt authority of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. they have existed together for longer than the world has had its current shape, and they will exist together long after our sun has grown cold, and they have never once, not for a single myth, fully understood each other. The Greeks saw no contradiction in this. Marriage, they understood, is not resolution. It is negotiation, continuous and eternal. What, then, is the legacy of Zeus? What does it mean that this particular figure, this stormy, tender, hypocritical, magnificent king of heaven, has occupied Western imagination for so many thousands of years? Perhaps it is this: Zeus represents our oldest and most honest portrait of authority. Not authority as we wish it were, perfectly just, perfectly consistent beyond temptation, but authority as it actually tends to exist in the world, capable of tremendous good, susceptible to tremendous weakness, impressive in its power and humbling in its failures. He is every king who ever ruled well on Monday and badly on Thursday. He is every leader who made the right call in the crisis and the wrong call in the quiet, ordinary moments when no one was watching. The Greeks did not build their king of gods to be worshipped without reservation. They built him to be recognized, to be looked at and understood, the way you understand something true about the world, even when that truth is not entirely comfortable. He rules from the mountain. The clouds gather around him. The storm is always, just barely, in his hands. And somewhere below, on a plain in Greece, or a street in a modern city, or in the particular stillness of a field before the thunder arrives, a person looks up and feels something ancient stir in them, something that was there long before they had a name for it, something that knows, without being told, that the sky has a temper and that it is watching. Hera, queen of Olympus, goddess of marriage, keeper of the sacred bond. There is a particular kind of power that is almost never written about honestly. Not the power of the conqueror, which fills libraries, not the power of the warrior, which fills epics, but the power of the one who holds the center together, while everyone else gets to be magnificent. The power of the one who maintains the institution, protects the order, keeps the architecture of civilization standing, while the celebrated figures move through it freely, carelessly, taking for granted the walls that someone else built, and is still, quietly, maintaining. That is Hera's power. And because it is the kind of power that tends to be invisible until it is threatened, she is perhaps the most misunderstood figure on all of Olympus. She deserves better than that. She always has. Hera is the daughter of Kronos and Rhea, which means she shares Zeus's origins entirely. Swallowed as an infant, rescued, raised to divinity, forged in the same cosmic war. She is not younger than Zeus in any meaningful sense. She is not lesser. In some of the oldest traditions, she was worshipped long before Zeus became the dominant figure of the Greek pantheon, with ancient temples and deep cult followings across Argos, Samos, and Corinth that predate the fully formed Olympian mythology by centuries. There is a strong current of scholarly thought that suggests Hera represents an even older layer of religious feeling, a great goddess of an earlier age who was, over time, absorbed into the new divine family structure and given a role that did not entirely suit her original scale. She became a wife, the divine embodiment of marriage itself, and the man she was given to or chose, depending on which version you trust, was Zeus. Their courtship, in the myths, is not particularly romantic. In one account, Zeus transforms himself into a bedraggled cuckoo during a storm, and Hera, taking pity on the small shivering bird, tucks it inside her robes to warm it, at which point Zeus resumes his true form. The myth records Hera's response as one of the great underreactions in all of literature. She agrees to marry him, provided the union is made legitimate and public. She does not want a secret. She will not accept a partial arrangement. From the very first moment, Hera understands something that Zeus perhaps does not fully grasp. that the form of a thing matters as much as the thing itself, that a commitment without ceremony is not a commitment at all. It is a convenience. Their wedding, when it finally happens, is extraordinary by any measure. The gods assembled, the universe celebrated, the earth bloomed with impossible flowers, and the Hesperides, those daughters of evening who guard the golden apple tree, gave Hera a wedding gift that only she could be trusted to keep, golden apples of immortality, planted in a garden at the world's western edge. It was, by all accounts, a magnificent beginning. What followed was considerably more complicated. The stories that most people know about Hera tend to focus on her as the pursuer, the jealous wife who tracks down Zeus's lovers across the ancient world and makes their lives catastrophic. Io transformed into a heifer. Callisto turned into a bear. Semele manipulated into requesting something that destroyed her. Leto hounded across every land as she tried to find somewhere safe to give birth to Apollo and Artemis. Heracles, the greatest of all Greek heroes, Zeus's most celebrated mortal son, persecuted from his very cradle, burdened with 12 impossible labors, shadowed by Hera's animosity across his entire legendary life. These stories are real. They are in the texts, they are painted on the vases, they are carved into the temples. But to read them only as evidence of jealousy, simple, petty, domestic jealousy, is to miss the deeper architecture of what is actually happening. Hera is not merely jealous, she is wronged, systematically, repeatedly, publicly wronged by the most powerful figure in the universe, who happens to also be her husband, which means that every act of infidelity is not just a personal betrayal, but a cosmological statement about her own status and authority. Each time Zeus pursues another lover, he is not simply being unfaithful. He is announcing to every god and mortal who can see that the Queen of Heaven is not sufficient, that the bond she represents, marriage, the sacred and civilizing institution she literally embodies as a deity, can be broken by the very being who made it with her. The Greeks, with their characteristic and uncomfortable honesty, built into their Queen of Heaven a fury that is not irrational. It is the only rational response available to her. She cannot punish Zeus directly. He is too powerful, and the structure of Olympus does not permit it. So she does what people do when they cannot reach the source of their pain. She reaches for what she can reach. She is not gentle about it. And yet, and this is the part of Hera that tends to get lost, she is never broken by it. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Hera endures a marriage that would have destroyed a lesser being, and she endures it without surrendering her dignity, her authority, or her sense of herself. She schemes magnificently. In the Iliad, when she wants to distract Zeus long enough to aid the Greeks at Troy against his wishes, she borrows Aphrodite's enchanted girdle, adorns herself with exquisite care, and seduces her own husband so completely that he forgets, in that suspended golden hour, every mortal woman he has ever loved. She does not simper. She does not beg. She uses every resource available to her with cool, practiced intelligence, and she wins. She is, in this way, one of the great strategic minds on Olympus. Athena may have wisdom as her divine domain, but Hera has something that complements it: institutional knowledge. She understands the structure of power more deeply than almost anyone, because she has spent eternity both inhabiting it and being constrained by it. She knows where the pressure points are. She knows which alliances hold and which ones bend. She knows that patience, applied consistently and without sentiment, is a more reliable weapon than any thunderbolt. Her role as goddess of marriage is not incidental to her character. It is the key to understanding her entirely. In ancient Greek society, marriage was not primarily a romantic institution. It was a civic one. It was the foundation of the household, and the household was the foundation of the city. and the city was the foundation of civilization itself. Hera, as the divine patron of that institution, was understood to be one of the most socially essential of all the gods. Women prayed to her at their weddings. They prayed to her in childbirth, in partnership with Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth whom many traditions consider Hera's daughter. They prayed to her when marriages became difficult, which is to say, they prayed to her often. And the goddess they were addressing was one who knew, from direct and eternal experience, precisely what marital difficulty felt like. There is something remarkable in that. The goddess of marriage is not a figure of uncomplicated domestic happiness. She is a figure who has lived inside the full complexity of the institution she governs, the loyalty and the betrayal, the power and the powerlessness, the long patience required to remain committed to something that does not always deserve your commitment. She is not an idealization. She is a witness. Her sacred animals are the peacock, resplendent, proud, impossible to overlook, and the cow, ancient symbol of maternal wealth and patient strength. Her sacred city was Argos, where her temple stood long before the Parthenon was a dream. The Milky Way itself, in one of the oldest and most beautiful of Greek myths, was formed from her breast milk, spilled across the heavens when she pulled away from the infant Heracles, the very child she would spend a lifetime persecuting, because she had been tricked into nursing him while she slept, and woke to find Zeus's illegitimate son at her breast. Even in that story, especially in that story, the universe is literally made larger by Hera's rejection. The galaxy we live in bears the trace of her refusal. The cosmos carries her mark. She sits on Olympus now, in the stories, golden-throned and clear-eyed, watching the world with an expression that is difficult to read from this distance. Not quite satisfaction, not quite sorrow, something more measured than either. She is the queen. She has always been the queen. And whatever Zeus does, wherever he goes, whatever bright and careless thing he pursues next across the wide face of the world, she will be there when he returns. Waiting, knowing, undiminished. The marriage holds. It has always held, not because it is easy, nothing about it is easy, but because some bonds, once made at the scale of the divine, cannot be unmade, only endured, and endured again, and endured. With the full, formidable grace of someone who has decided that endurance itself is a form of victory. Poseidon, god of the sea, shaker of the earth, master of the deep. The sea to the ancient Greeks was not a backdrop. It was the condition of everything. Greece is not so much a country as it is a collection of edges, coastlines, peninsulas, island chains, scattered like the aftermath of something enormous that shattered long ago and never quite reassembled. To live in the ancient Greek world was to live in permanent, intimate relationship with salt water. The sea was the road between cities. It was the source of food. It was the arena of trade and the highway of war. It was the boundary at the end of the known world, beyond which things became uncertain in ways that the human mind has never handled comfortably. The sea was, in the most literal and practical sense, life. And it was, with equal reliability and no particular apology, death. Small wonder, then, that the god the Greeks placed over it was not a gentle figure, not a benevolent shepherd of the waves, but something vast and moody and fundamentally untamed, even by his own considerable standards, a being who had ruled an entire kingdom of the world since before memory began, and who still, after all that time, had not made peace with the fact that his brother got the sky. Poseidon is, like Zeus and Hera, a child of Kronos and Rhea. He shares their story entirely. The swallowing, the stone, the rescue, the war. He fought alongside Zeus in the 10-year battle against the Titans, and when victory came and the cosmos was divided, the three brothers drew lots to determine their domains. Zeus drew the sky. Hades drew the underworld. Poseidon drew the sea. Exactly how he felt about this arrangement depends on which myth you consult, but the general tenor of his character throughout all of Greek literature suggests that Poseidon accepted his kingdom the way a proud and powerful man accepts something he cannot change, with outward compliance and inward resentment that surfaces periodically in ways that are extremely inconvenient for everyone nearby. He is, to put it plainly, the most easily offended of all the Olympians. And given the competition on that mountain, that is a significant distinction. His physical domain is staggering in its scale. The sea, in Greek cosmology, surrounded the entire known world. The Mediterranean, the Atlantic beyond it. The great rivers that the ancients believed flowed from an encircling ocean at the world's rim. All of it fell under Poseidon's authority. He moved through it in a chariot pulled by hippocampi, creatures that were horse in the front and fish behind. And when he drove across the water, the waves flattened themselves before him, and sea creatures rose to escort him, joyful and enormous, trailing foam. His palace lay somewhere beneath the Aegean, built from coral and pearl, and the compressed silence of the deep places where no light reaches. But the sea was only the beginning of his portfolio. Poseidon was also in a domain that seems almost contradictory until you understand the Greek geological imagination, the god of earthquakes. The Greeks called him Enosikthon, the earth shaker. And they were not speaking metaphorically. In a landscape as seismically active as ancient Greece, earthquakes were a constant and terrifying reality, and the Greeks observed, correctly in their way, that the sea and the shaking earth seemed to arrive together, that great tremors often preceded tidal waves, that the coastlines were the most vulnerable places when the ground decided to move. Poseidon caused both. When he was displeased, which was not infrequently, he struck the earth with his trident and the ground split apart. Harbors collapsed. Cliffs fell into the sea. The earth opened in ways that reminded everyone, with awful efficiency, that the surface of the world is not as solid as it appears. He also held dominion over horses. This association is ancient and somewhat mysterious, but it persists across all of Greek tradition. Poseidon was understood to have created the horse, striking his trident against a rock and producing the first one fully formed. The horse was the animal of speed, of war, of the aristocratic world, and Poseidon's connection to it links him not just to the sea, but to a kind of raw, muscular, earthbound power that complements his oceanic sovereignty. He is not only the god of the water, he is the god of force in motion in all its forms. To understand Poseidon's character, you need only look at the great contest for Athens, the city, or rather, the rocky promontory of the Acropolis that would become the city needed a divine patron. Two gods presented themselves, Poseidon and Athena. The contest was simple. Each would offer the people a gift, and the people would choose. Poseidon went first. He struck his trident against the rock of the Acropolis with tremendous theatrical force, and from the fissure sprang a saltwater spring, an astonishing demonstration of power, of the god's ability to cool the sea itself up from the earth. It was magnificent. It was overwhelming. It was, by any measure of divine spectacle, extraordinary. And then Athena knelt quietly and planted an olive tree. An olive tree. Small, silver-leafed, modest in comparison to the eruption of salt water that still gleamed beside it. But an olive tree means oil, which means light and warmth in winter. It means food. It means wood for tools and ships. It means commerce and healing and the slow, patient accumulation of a civilization. The people of Athens chose Athena's gift, and the city bore her name. And Poseidon, furious, humiliated before mortals and gods alike, flooded the plain of Attica in retribution. He could not accept losing. he never quite could. This pattern repeats throughout his mythology with a consistency that is almost rhythmic. Poseidon wants something, a city's allegiance, a mortal's love, a particular stretch of coastline or sacred spring, and when he is denied it, the sea rises. His rivalry with Athena is long and simmering. His rivalry with Helios over Corinth, his rivalry with Hera over Argos, his rivalry with Zeus himself runs as a quiet undercurrent through many of the myths, surfacing in moments of particular tension. There is even a tradition in which Poseidon joins a conspiracy with Hera and Athena to bind Zeus, a rebellion that fails, but that tells us something important about the mood on Olympus beneath its golden surface. These were not a family at peace. They were a family that had chosen proximity and power over harmony, and was living eternally with the results. His loves, like Zeus's, are numerous and frequently turbulent. His great marriage is to Amphitrite, a Nereid, one of the 50 sea-nymph daughters of the old sea god Nereus, and their union, unlike the war between Zeus and Hera, has a certain quieter dignity to it. Amphitrite is sometimes depicted as a genuine queen of the sea in her own right, riding beside Poseidon, commanding the creatures of the deep with her own authority. She is not powerless, but she is also married to Poseidon, which means she endures what Hera endures and responds to it with something closer to weary sovereignty than active retaliation. His relationship with the Nereid Scylla tells the darker version of his loves. Amphitrite, tired of her husband's pursuit of the beautiful nymph, threw herbs into Scylla's bathing pool and transformed her into the monster who would one day guard the strait between Italy and Sicily. The same monster that Odysseus must navigate past, losing 6 men to her multiple heads. The sea produces wonders, and it produces horrors, and sometimes it produces both from the same source. His relationship with the Gorgon Medusa is one of the most layered and difficult in all of Greek myth. In the older traditions, older than Perseus, older than the familiar story of the severed head, Medusa was not always a monster. She was a beautiful mortal woman, a priestess of Athena, and Poseidon took her by force inside Athena's own temple. Athena's response, punishing Medusa rather than Poseidon, is one of the moments in Greek mythology that modern readers find most troubling, and rightly so. But it illuminates something important about the power dynamics of Olympus. Athena could not touch Poseidon, who was her uncle and her equal in divine rank. She could only reach what was reachable. The injustice is written into the myth deliberately, as an acknowledgement that power rarely faces its own consequences, and that the damage tends to fall somewhere else entirely. And yet, and this is always the complication with Poseidon, he is also capable of something that functions very much like genuine feeling. His love for the mortal Pelops is one of the tenderest stories in a mythology not overly burdened with tenderness. Poseidon carried the boy to Olympus, gave him a golden chariot pulled by tireless horses, and when Pelops was returned to the mortal world and needed to compete in a deadly chariot race to win the woman he loved, it was those divine horses that carried him to victory. Poseidon did not act out of ownership or conquest in this story. He acted, the myth suggests, out of something genuinely close to love. He grieved, too. His son Theseus, or the man he believed to be his son, in the painful confusion of that myth, cursed his other son Hippolytus to death on the basis of a lie, and Poseidon, bound by a divine oath to grant 3 wishes, fulfilled the curse before the truth became clear. The great waves rose on his command and destroyed the boy on the road, and the god of the sea learned, as so many of the Olympians learned, that absolute power does not protect you from absolute regret. What endures from Poseidon across the centuries is not the anger, it is the awe. Every civilization that has ever stood at the edge of the ocean and looked out at the horizon has understood, in some pre-rational, body-level way, that the sea operates by rules that are not its own, that it has moods, that it responds to things, that it is not merely water, but something with a nature, a will, a terrifying and magnificent personality. Poseidon is the Greek name for that feeling. He is the personification of the moment when the sea changes from a road into a force, from a resource into a reckoning. Sailors in ancient Greece poured wine into the water before long voyages. They built temples at capes and headlands, the last solid ground before the open water, and left offerings there, asking for passage, asking for mercy, asking the earth shaker to keep his hands still just long enough for them to get home. The prayer was not irrational. The sea is still what it always was, still vast, still indifferent in its way, still capable of everything. And on certain days, when the water goes dark and the swell begins to build and the horizon disappears behind a wall of weather that no forecast quite predicted, the old feeling comes back, the sense that something beneath the surface has shifted. That something down there, in the cold and the dark and the fathomless pressure of the deep, has changed its mind. He is not gone. He has simply gone quiet for a while. The trident is still there, resting, waiting. The earthshaker does not rush. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, mother of seasons, bearer of the sacred grain. Before Zeus claimed the sky, before Poseidon took the sea, before any of the dramatic architecture of Olympus was assembled, before all of it, there was the earth. And the earth grew things. And what the earth grew was the difference between a people who survived the winter and a people who did not. This is not mythology. This is biology. This is the bare, unadorned reality of what it meant to be human for the vast majority of human history. That the harvest was not a pleasant seasonal event, but the single most important thing that happened in a year. Everything else, war, politics, art, philosophy, love, was conducted in the space that a successful harvest made possible. When the crops failed, civilization did not slow down. It stopped. It starved. It buried its children. The goddess who governed that reality was not, therefore, a minor figure. She was not a pleasant rural spirit of meadows and flowers. She was one of the most powerful and most feared of all the Olympians, because her mood determined whether you ate next spring. And Demeter, as the myths would make abundantly and memorably clear, was a goddess who had moods. She is the daughter of Kronos and Rhea, sister to Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Hades, and Hestia. She sits among the 12 as the embodiment of cultivated earth, not wild nature, not the untamed forest, but the earth as humanity has shaped it. The plowed field, the planted row, the slow, patient miracle of a seed becoming bread. Her domain is civilization in its most fundamental form, the agreement between human hands and fertile ground that makes everything else possible. She is most often depicted simply, almost austerely, by the standards of Olympian iconography, where Aphrodite gleams and Artemis flashes and Athena blazes. Demeter stands in the field. She holds wheat sheaves. She wears a crown of grain. There is nothing theatrical about her presentation, because there is nothing theatrical about what she represents. She is not a spectacle. She is a necessity. But do not mistake plainness for mildness. The central myth of Demeter is one of the oldest, most widely told, and most emotionally complete stories in all of Greek tradition. It is, at its heart, a story about a mother and a daughter. And like the best stories of that kind, it contains the whole world inside it. Her daughter was Persephone, called also Kore, simply the girl. And she was, by all accounts, the light of the world. She moved through the meadows, gathering flowers with the unconscious grace of someone who does not yet know that the world can take things from you. She was young. She was radiant. She was not yet acquainted with permanence. One day, in a meadow in Sicily or Attica or Arcadia, The location shifts depending on who tells the story, as though the grief refuses to be pinned to any one place. The earth opened. A great chasm split the ground, and from it came Hades, lord of the dead, in his black chariot pulled by immortal horses. He had seen Persephone. He had decided, and in the way of gods who have decided, he did not ask. He took her. The earth closed. The meadow was silent, and Demeter, somewhere above, heard her daughter cry out once, and then heard nothing more. What follows is one of the most quietly devastating passages in all of ancient myth. Demeter searches. For 9 days and 9 nights she walks the earth with torches, neither eating nor sleeping nor bathing, asking every mortal and immortal she encounters if they have seen her daughter. Most have not. Most turn away. The sun god Helios, who sees everything from his daily passage across the sky, eventually tells her the truth, that it was Hades who took the girl, and that Zeus himself had sanctioned it. The grief that descends on Demeter at this revelation is not the operatic, performative grief of mythology. It is something quieter and more total. She withdraws from Olympus entirely. She disguises herself as an old woman, grey-haired, unremarkable, the kind of figure no one looks at twice, and walks among mortals in mourning. She finds her way to Eleusis, where the king's family takes her in without recognizing her. And she sits by their well in the darkness, and she does not eat, and she does not smile, and the warmth goes out of her completely. And as Demeter withdraws, as the goddess of the harvest turns inward with her grief, the world begins, very slowly, to die. The grain does not grow, the fruit does not set. The olive trees drop their leaves unseasonably and stand bare and skeletal against a sky that has turned the wrong color. Animals grow thin. The ground, unblessed, refuses to accept seed. Winter arrives and does not leave, because winter is only the natural world in Demeter's absence, and Demeter is gone so completely that even the memory of warmth seems to be receding from the world like a tide going out and not returning. Mortals begin to starve. And as they starve, the sacrifices stop, the offerings, the prayers, the smoke of altars rising to feed the gods. And the gods begin, with increasing urgency, to realize that this particular grief cannot be allowed to continue. That Demeter, in mourning, is not simply a sad mother, she is an extinction event. Zeus intervenes eventually, as he must, dispatching Hermes to the underworld to retrieve Persephone. And Hades, outnumbered and outmaneuvered by Olympian consensus, agrees to release her. But, and here the myth turns on its hinge, in the way that the best myths always do. Before Persephone leaves, she eats 6 pomegranate seeds in most tellings. Some say it was Hades who offered them, knowing the ancient law that bound all who consumed food in the underworld to return to it. Some say Persephone chose to eat, knowing the same thing, that the seeds were a way of keeping one foot in the kingdom of the dead, of maintaining something that was now, however strangely, also hers. The consequence is the compromise that defines the world as we know it. Persephone will spend part of the year with her husband in the underworld, and part of the year with her mother in the light, and when she descends each autumn, Demeter grieves, and the world grows cold, and the grain retreats into the earth to wait. And when Persephone returns each spring, the goddess of the harvest is made whole again, and the earth responds to her joy with an extravagance of growing things. Flowers before the cold has entirely left, green shoots pushing through soil that was frost hard the week before. The world in full and urgent bloom, as though trying to make up for lost time. The seasons, in this myth, are not meteorological. They are emotional. They are the annual rhythm of a mother's grief and a mother's relief, written into the turning of the earth itself. At Eleusis, on the road between Athens and the sea, The Greeks built one of the most sacred sites in the ancient world, the sanctuary where Demeter had rested in her wandering, where she had first sat by the well in disguise and sorrowed. And there, for nearly 2,000 years, from at least the 15th century BCE to the 4th century CE, they held the Eleusinian mysteries. We know very little about what actually happened inside them. The initiates swore oaths of absolute secrecy that, remarkably, held for all of recorded Greek and Roman history. Not one initiate wrote down what they saw or experienced in the inner rites. What we know is the outline, a procession from Athens along the sacred road, a period of fasting that mirrored Demeter's own mourning, a night of ritual inside the great hall at Eleusis, and some experience, some revelation that initiates described afterward only in terms of what it had done to them, not what it was. They said it had removed their fear of death, that they had seen something that made the boundary between life and death feel different than it had before. Cicero, who was initiated, wrote that among all the gifts Athens had given the world, the mysteries were the most important. Whatever happened inside that great hall in the firelight, surrounded by the symbols of grain and pomegranate, and the story of a mother who loved her daughter so completely that the world grew cold without her. It was enough to transform people. For 2,000 years, it transformed them. Demeter stands in her field as she has always stood, patient, permanent, watching the horizon with eyes that know, from the oldest and most personal of experiences, that what goes into the earth is not lost. It is waiting. Everything that is planted in the dark, in the cold, in the silence of grief, comes back. It always comes back. The wheat knows this. The mother knows this. And now, perhaps, so do we. Athena, goddess of wisdom, patron of Athens, weaver of strategy and craft, she was not born the way gods are usually born. She was not born the way anyone is usually born. The story begins with Zeus and a Titaness named Metis, whose name, in Greek, means quite simply wisdom, counsel, cunning thought. Metis was the first great love of Zeus, and she was, by the reckoning of most ancient sources, the wisest being in creation. When Zeus was fighting to free his siblings from Kronos, it was Metis who provided the emetic that undid the Titan's terrible feast. She was, in the most literal sense, the intelligence behind Zeus's earliest and most important victory. But Gaia, the earth herself, the source of all prophecy, whispered something to Zeus that changed everything. She told him that Metis was fated to bear children of surpassing power. The first would be a daughter of unmatched wisdom. The second would be a son more powerful than his father. Zeus, who had come to power by overthrowing his father, who understood better than anyone what that prophecy meant, did what his father had done before him. He swallowed Metis whole. It is one of the great ironies of Greek mythology that Zeus, in trying to prevent his fate, perfectly replicated his own origin story. But the consequence this time was not liberation. It was transformation. Metis continued her work inside Zeus, continued thinking, continued crafting. She made armor for the daughter she was carrying. She made a helmet, a spear, a breastplate of divine construction. And as she worked, forging immortal weapons inside the mind of the king of gods, the pressure built until Zeus was struck by a headache so agonizing, so cosmically unbearable, that he begged Hephaestus, or, in some tellings, Hermes, or the Titan Prometheus, to open his skull and release whatever was inside. The axe fell. The skull opened, and Athena sprang out fully formed, fully grown, fully armored, shrieking her war cry so loudly that heaven and earth shook at the sound, and the sun stopped in its course, and the sea rose in a wave that pulled back again when it saw what had arrived. She was wisdom born from the mind of power. Strategy descended from the union of intelligence and authority. She carried inside her, From the first moment of her existence, the combined inheritance of the wisest being who had ever lived, and the most powerful being in creation. Is it any wonder she was extraordinary? Athena is one of the three virgin goddesses of Olympus, alongside Artemis and Hestia, and her choice of celibacy is not incidental to her character. It is foundational to it. Where Aphrodite's power flows through desire, and Hera's authority is bound to the institution of marriage, Athena exists in a space entirely outside those structures. She owes nothing to any arrangement. She has aligned herself with no husband whose agenda she must navigate, no lover whose moods she must manage. She is sovereign over herself completely, in a way that was genuinely radical for the world that created her. The Greeks called her Pallas Athena. The precise etymology of Pallas is debated still, but one tradition holds. It refers to a childhood friend she accidentally killed during a spear-throwing contest, and whose name she took in grief and in honor. Another holds it simply means young woman, girl, the strong one. Either way, it adds a dimension to her that the armored, battle-ready image tends to obscure. She was, once, young enough to have a friend, young enough to feel the weight of loss. The wisdom she carries is not purely abstract, it has cost her something. Her domains are numerous and more varied than any simple title captures. She is the goddess of wisdom, yes, but not the placid, contemplative wisdom of philosophy alone. She is the goddess of practical intelligence, of strategy in war, and skill in craft, and the particular brilliance required to solve problems that have no clean solution. The Greeks distinguished between two kinds of conflict: Ares war, which is brute force, blood, and chaos, and Athena war, which is planned, disciplined, and prosecuted with intelligence toward a defined objective. When armies want simply to destroy, they pray to Ares. When armies want to win, they pray to Athena. She is also the patron of craftspeople, of weavers, potters, carpenters, metalworkers, shipbuilders, anyone who takes raw material and transforms it through skill and knowledge into something that did not exist before. This connection between wisdom and making is one of the most beautiful ideas embedded in her mythology, that intelligence is not merely contemplative, not merely strategic, but deeply, essentially creative, that the highest form of thought expresses itself in the made object, in the cloth that took 3 months to weave and tells a story in its pattern, in the ship that carries civilization across dark water, in the pot that holds the olive oil that lights the winter through. No myth captures the complexity of Athena's character more completely than the story of Arachne. Arachne was a mortal weaver of extraordinary talent, so extraordinary that people came from all over Lydia simply to watch her work. Her fingers moved through the threads with a fluency that seemed supernatural, and the tapestries she produced were so perfect, so alive, that the nymphs themselves were said to leave their rivers and their trees to stand behind her and watch. She was celebrated everywhere, and she, being young and talented, and not yet acquainted with the particular danger of hubris in a world governed by gods, made the mistake of claiming that her skill exceeded Athena's own. Athena came to her disguised as an old woman, a favorite divine strategy, this assumption of age and insignificance, and gave Arachne the opportunity to recant, to soften the claim, to offer the conventional and prudent piety that the gods expected from mortals in these situations. Arachne refused. She wanted the contest. She invited the goddess openly to compete. They wove side by side. Athena produced a tapestry of divine perfection, the 12 Olympians in their glory, the fates of those mortals who had dared to challenge gods, an argument made in thread and color. This is what happens to those who forget their place. And Arachne, young, furious, brilliant, reckless Arachne, produced a tapestry that may have been equally perfect in technique, but which depicted something entirely different: the loves of Zeus, rendered in exquisite and unflattering detail, the deceptions, the disguises, the pursuits. Every time a god had behaved badly toward a mortal, Arachne wove it into her cloth with a clarity that left nothing comfortable, nothing heroic, nothing politely ambiguous. Athena looked at it, and she destroyed it. She tore the tapestry from the loom and struck Arachne 3 times on the forehead with her shuttle, and Arachne, unable to bear the shame of the destruction of her greatest work, hanged herself. Athena, in a gesture that is simultaneously merciful and terrible, transformed her. She loosened the noose into a thread, and from that thread Arachne became the first spider, condemned or liberated, depending on how you read it, to weave forever, to produce extraordinary things always, and to have them always swept away. The myth has troubled readers for centuries, and it should. Athena here is not the cool, just, disciplined figure of most of her stories. She is stung, genuinely stung, not merely by the challenge to her supremacy, but by the content of the tapestry, by the accuracy of it. Arachne held up a mirror to Olympus, and what Athena saw in it made her reach for the shuttle. This is not the reaction of a being secure in perfect virtue. This is the reaction of a being who understands that some truths are intolerable when rendered in perfect art. The story does not exonerate Athena, but it makes her real. Her relationship with Odysseus is perhaps the most revealing of all her mortal partnerships, because it extends across years and miles and the full length of the Odyssey. One of the longest and most demanding acts of divine patronage in all of Greek literature. She loves Odysseus the way wisdom loves a mind that uses it well. He is not the strongest hero. That is Heracles. Not the most beautiful. That is Paris or Achilles. Not the most ferociously brave. That is Ajax, who carries his shield like a wall and never once thinks about retreating. But Odysseus is the cleverest. He is the one who wins the Trojan War, not with a sword, but with a wooden horse. He is the one who, when blinded by circumstance and battered by misfortune and lost at sea for years, keeps thinking, keeps adapting, keeps reaching through every catastrophe for the next possible solution. Athena watches over him the way a teacher watches a student who has genuinely understood something, with a fierce, particular pride that is not quite affection and not quite professional satisfaction, but something that contains elements of both. She advocates for him on Olympus. She intervenes at critical moments in his journey, and when he finally returns to Ithaca, 10 years after the war ended, 20 years after he left, it is Athena who orchestrates his disguise, Athena who keeps Penelope faithful and intelligent and waiting, Athena who stands at his shoulder in the final confrontation with the suitors, not fighting for him but making sure he does not lose. She does not protect him from difficulty. She never removes the obstacles. She simply ensures that the obstacles remain solvable by a sufficiently intelligent person, which is, when you consider it, the truest and most honest form of divine assistance available, not rescue. Accompaniment. The Parthenon stands on the Acropolis of Athens still, or rather, the ruin of it stands, which is itself a kind of standing that most buildings never achieve. It was built in the 5th century BCE to house a statue of Athena, so enormous it was visible from ships approaching Athens from the sea, 40 feet tall, made of ivory and gold. The goddess in full armor with her helmet pushed back and her hand extended, a small figure of Nike. Victory, resting on her open palm. The Parthenon is the most studied, most argued about, most influential building in the history of Western architecture. Its proportions have been copied in parliament buildings and courthouses and universities across the world. The columns of justice and learning, everywhere you look, are Doric and Ionic echoes of a temple built to intelligence itself, on a hill above a city that believed with genuine conviction that wisdom was worth that kind of monument. Athens named itself for Athena, not for Zeus the most powerful, not for Poseidon the most fearsome, for the grey-eyed goddess who offered not a spectacular eruption of divine force, but the quiet, enduring, irreplaceable gift of the olive tree, of the thing that sustains you, of the light that lets you work when the sun goes down. She is with us still, though we have changed her name several times. She is in the lecture hall and the laboratory. She is in the architect's drawing and the engineer's calculation. She is in the courtroom argument constructed overnight by a lawyer who did not sleep, and in the novel revised for the 20th time until it finally says what it was always trying to say. She is in every moment when a human being, faced with a problem that does not yield to force, steps back, thinks carefully, and finds the angle that no one else had seen. She does not announce herself. She never has. She simply appears in the moment when clarity arrives, that sudden, unmistakable feeling of understanding settling into place like a key finding a lock. And then she is gone again, and you are left with the answer and the vague, inexplicable sense that you were not entirely alone when you found it. Grey-eyed, present, already thinking about the next problem. Apollo, god of the sun, patron of prophecy, lord of music and healing. Of all the 12 Olympians, Apollo is perhaps the one the Greeks loved most completely. Not feared, as they feared Zeus. Not depended upon, as they depended upon Demeter. Not respected with the cautious, arm's-length admiration they gave Athena. Loved, with the slightly breathless, aspirational quality of love that is directed at something you recognize as better than yourself, and that makes you want, in its presence, to be better too. He was the god of the sun, or more accurately, of the light the sun carries. He was the god of music and poetry, of prophecy and truth, of healing and medicine, of archery, of reason, of order, of the careful and luminous application of the mind to the world's beautiful complexity. He was, in short, the god of everything the Greeks most wanted to believe they were capable of becoming. He was their aspiration made divine. And like all aspirations held in human hands, he was also, when the myths demanded honesty, capable of falling somewhat catastrophically short. His birth alone is enough to establish the dramatic register of his mythology. Apollo is the son of Zeus and the Titaness Leto, one of Zeus's many divine liaisons, and one that drew, as they reliably did, the full force of Hera's fury. Hera, in her wrath, decreed that Leto could find no solid ground on which to give birth. No island, no shore, no stretch of earth that lay still and firm beneath the sky could receive her. The land itself, in fear of Hera's punishment, refused her. Leto wandered, heavily pregnant with twins, across the surface of the world, turned away everywhere, finding no place to rest, no place to deliver the children that were coming, regardless of Hera's edicts. The image is one of the most quietly powerful in all of Greek mythology. A goddess in need, moving across a world that has collectively agreed to look away. What finally received her was Delos, a tiny floating island in the Aegean, technically not fixed to the earth, and therefore technically beyond the scope of Hera's prohibition. Delos, which had nothing, no resources, no agricultural wealth, no strategic significance, offered what everything else had refused. And Leto gave birth there, on its rocky shore, leaning against a palm tree, with Artemis, born first, immediately turning to assist in the delivery of her twin brother. Apollo arrived in light. The moment he was born, legend says, Delos was flooded with gold, and swans circled the island singing, and the island itself, which had always drifted, became fixed to the sea floor at last, anchored forever by the honor of what it had witnessed. It became one of the most sacred sites in the ancient Greek world. Pilgrims crossed the Aegean to stand on its rocky shore for 1,000 years, because the ground there had once held something extraordinary, and ground remembers. Apollo's first act, upon reaching his divine maturity, tells you almost everything you need to know about the difference between Athena's kind of power and his. At Delphi, the navel of the world, the Greeks believed, the exact center of all things, there lived a serpent called Python. Vast, ancient, chthonic in the truest sense, a creature of the earth's deep places, of the old order that preceded the Olympians, guardian of the prophetic vapors that rose from a crack in the rock and induced visions in those who breathed them. Python had been there since before the world was organized, and it had not asked for Olympian oversight, and it was not inclined to welcome it. Apollo killed it, not with strategy, not with guile. He was not Athena, and the Python was not a problem to be thought through. He came with his silver bow, and he poured arrows into the monster until the ancient thing lay dead on the sacred ground, and from its body rose, slowly, the sanctuary that would become the Oracle of Delphi. The greatest prophetic site in the ancient world, consulted by kings and generals and city-states for nearly 1,000 years, sat on the bones of the old order that Apollo had personally ended. He was light coming into darkness and claiming it. That is what the myth is saying. He is the arrival of the solar, the rational, the ordered, the harmonious, into a world that had previously belonged to older and stranger things. His instrument was the lyre, and the story of how he came to possess it is one of the more charming in the Olympian catalogue. On the very day of his birth, or shortly after, depending on the telling, his infant half-brother Hermes crept away from his cradle and stole Apollo's cattle, driving them backward across Greece to confuse any tracker, hiding them in a cave in Arcadia. Then Hermes, perhaps to settle his nerves after this audacious theft, found a tortoise, hollowed its shell, strung it with the intestines of 2 of the stolen cattle, and played the instrument he had invented. He played something so beautiful, so unprecedented, so entirely new under the sun, that when Apollo eventually found him, furious, divinely certain of what had happened and who was responsible, Hermes simply played the lyre for him. Apollo stopped. He forgot for a moment why he had come. He made the trade, the cattle for the instrument. The lyre changed hands, and Apollo became its master, and music became his domain as completely as light and prophecy and healing were his domains, which is to say, it became inseparable from what he was. He played at the feasts of the gods. He led the muses in their singing. When he walked onto Olympus with his lyre in hand, the other gods went quiet and listened, because some things do not require competition. Some things simply require room to be heard. The oracle at Delphi operated for centuries under Apollo's patronage, and its influence on the ancient world can hardly be overstated. Before any major military campaign, Greek commanders came to Delphi. Before founding a new colony, city-states sent delegations to consult the Pythia, the oracle priestess who sat on a tripod above the sacred fissure and breathed the vapors and spoke in Apollo's name. The responses she gave were famously, notoriously, poetically ambiguous. Croesus, king of Lydia, asked the oracle whether he should attack Persia. The response told him that if he did, a great empire would fall. He attacked. A great empire did fall, his own. The oracle had been perfectly accurate, as it always was, in a way that was perfectly useless. This ambiguity was not a flaw. It was the point. Apollo was the god of truth. He who does not lie was one of his epithets. But the truth, as anyone who has spent time with it understands, is rarely simple. It does not announce itself in direct sentences. It arrives oblique, refracted, demanding interpretation. The Delphic oracle's genius was not in prediction. It was in forcing the petitioner to think, to consider possibilities they had not entertained, to carry the ambiguity home with them and sit with it until understanding came. Apollo did not tell you what would happen. He gave you the information required to see it, if you were honest enough with yourself to look. The inscription above the entrance to his temple at Delphi has never been improved upon. Know thyself. Two words, the entire foundation of Western philosophical inquiry. Apollo's gift to the world was not certainty. It was the practice of honest self-examination, the insistence that the beginning of wisdom is not knowledge of the stars or the gods or the movements of armies, but knowledge of the self that is asking the questions. And yet, for all his light, for all his solar perfection, Apollo's loves are among the most tragic in all of mythology. He loved Hyacinthus, a Spartan youth of surpassing beauty, with a genuine and uncomplicated tenderness that is touching precisely because it is so unlike his usual radiance. They spent their days together in athletic contests on the open ground, and Apollo was happy in the simple, present way that gods rarely allowed themselves to be. Zephyrus, the west wind, also loved Hyacinthus and watched this happiness with divine jealousy. One afternoon, as Apollo taught the boy to throw the discus, Zephyrus redirected the throw, and the discus struck Hyacinthus in the head, and the boy died in Apollo's arms on the grass where they had been playing. Apollo, who could heal almost anything, could not heal this. The laws governing death were not his to override. He held the boy and refused to let Hermes take his shade to the underworld. And from the blood that fell on the ground he made a flower, the hyacinth, marked with the letters of grief, AI, which in Greek is the cry of mourning. He made something beautiful from the loss, because beauty was the only language he had, and even beauty was not enough. He loved Daphne, daughter of the river god Peneus, and pursued her with the helpless urgency of someone who does not know how to love quietly. She refused him. She ran, and as his hand was about to close around her shoulder, she cried out to her father, and the river god transformed her into a laurel tree, bark closing over skin, branches spreading where arms had been, roots driving into the earth she had been running across. Apollo stood before the tree she had become, and wept, and declared the laurel sacred, and wore its branches ever after on his head. He could not have her. He could only honor her refusal for the rest of eternity. The laurel wreath, the crown of victory, of poetry, of achievement, was born from Apollo's inability to let go of something that had chosen to become unreachable rather than be caught. He loved Cassandra, the Trojan princess, and gave her the gift of prophecy. When she refused his love in return, he could not take the gift back. Divine gifts, once given, are permanent, and so he added a curse to it instead, that she would always speak true prophecy and no one would ever believe her. She saw Troy burning before the wooden horse had entered the gates. She told them. She screamed it in the streets of a city that was still standing, still celebrating its apparent victory, and no one listened. And Troy burned. Apollo is the god of the examined life, of the disciplined mind, of the music that elevates, and the truth that demands something of you. He is the patron of every poet who has sat alone in the early morning with the light coming through the window, and tried to find the exact right word for something that resists words, of every doctor who has sat with a patient and tried to locate the precise nature of what has gone wrong, of every philosopher who has written on a wall or a page, "Know thyself," and then had the honesty to admit that the instruction is simple and the work is lifelong. He drives his chariot of light across the sky each day, and the world below wakes up and turns its face toward the warmth, and the morning happens again, as it always does, as it always will, radiant, unhurried, terrible in his beauty, and generous with his light. Artemis, goddess of the hunt, lady of the moon, protector of the wild, she was born first. This is a detail that tends to get lost in the broad sweep of Olympian mythology, but it matters enormously to understanding her character. Artemis and Apollo are twins, children of Zeus and Leto, delivered on the floating island of Delos after their mother's long and desperate wandering. And Artemis came first, emerged into the world hours before her brother. And then, before she had been in existence long enough to take more than a few breaths of divine air, turned around and assisted in Apollo's birth. She was, from the very first moment of her existence, a protector, a helper in labor and in the crossing of difficult thresholds. The Greeks understood this, which is why Artemis was also, somewhat paradoxically for a virgin goddess of the hunt, the patron of childbirth, invoked by women in labor, called upon at the most vulnerable and dangerous moment of a human life. She who had entered the world and immediately helped another cross that same threshold. She who understood, from the inside, what it cost. But before any of that mythology accumulated around her, Artemis had already established, with the directness characteristic of someone who has known her own mind since before she could speak, exactly what she wanted from eternity. She was very young, still a child, in the divine chronology, when she climbed onto her father Zeus's knee and made her requests. She asked for eternal virginity, to be free of the marriage bond entirely. She asked for silver hunting arrows and a bow. She asked for the office of bringing light, like her brother, though she chose the moon, the cooler and more solitary luminary, to his son. She asked for the mountains as her domain. She asked for one city to call her own, but mostly she wanted the wild places. The forests, the marshes, the high rocky slopes above the tree line where civilization had not yet reached. And she asked for a company of nymphs to hunt beside her, sworn to the same chastity she chose for herself. Zeus, charmed and perhaps a little awed, gave her everything. He agreed so completely and so immediately that it suggests he understood something important, that Artemis was not asking permission. She was informing him of an arrangement that was already settled. She had merely chosen to do him the courtesy of letting him say yes. She is, in the truest sense, the most self-determined figure on Olympus, where Hera's identity is bound up with her relationship to Zeus, and Aphrodite's with the desires of others, and even Athena's with the mortals and heroes she chooses to guide. Artemis exists in a state of remarkable self-sufficiency. She is not defined by any relationship. She is not pursuing anything or anyone. She is simply in the forest, moving through her own domain, entirely at home in herself, in a way that the other gods, for all their power, rarely manage to be. The nymphs who hunt beside her, the Oceanids and Naiads and mountain spirits who take her oath and join her company, are not courtiers. They are companions. There is a genuine warmth in the way the myths depict Artemis among her retinue. She laughs with them, hunts alongside them, sleeps under the stars with them on the banks of rivers in the deep places of the world. She is not a distant, cold goddess of the wilderness. She is a goddess who loves the wilderness and everything in it, with a directness and a loyalty that she rarely bothers to disguise. That loyalty, however, has a precise and unwavering boundary. The oath of chastity she and her companions swear is not merely a personal preference, it is a covenant, and the myths that deal with its violation are among the most severe in all of Greek tradition. Severe not in the gleeful, punitive way of certain other divine interventions, but with the quality of a natural consequence. A boundary crossed, a law broken, the world rebalancing. Actaeon is the story that most people know. He was a hunter, a skilled one by mortal standards, trained by the centaur Chiron, and celebrated across Greece for his ability in the field. One afternoon, while hunting on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, he strayed into a wooded grotto where Artemis and her nymphs were bathing in a spring. He saw what he was not meant to see. The exact nature of Artemis's response has been interpreted many ways across the centuries. Ovid describes her blushing, turning away, reaching for water to throw at him in the absence of her bow. And it is the water itself, touched by divine intention, that transforms him. He becomes a stag. His own hunting hounds, who do not recognize their master in his new form, turn on him and tear him apart in the very forest he had spent his life hunting through. The myth contains no scene of judgment, no decree, no articulated punishment. It happens almost reflexively, an automatic consequence of contact with what was not meant to be contacted. Artemis does not condemn Actaeon with deliberation. The transformation occurs in the space between violation and response as quickly as shame arrives. What it says about Artemis is something important. Her protection of her sacred space is not political or performative. It is as natural as a forest fire after lightning strikes. She does not decide to punish. The boundary, once broken, produces consequences by its own force. The story of Orion is more complex and more painful. Orion was a giant hunter, son of Poseidon by most accounts, and he was, by the evidence of the myths, someone Artemis genuinely liked. They hunted together, they competed together, which among divine beings is a form of respect. There are traditions in which Artemis loved Orion, in the full weight of that word, and in which that love was the first and only time the goddess of the untamed places felt the tug of something she could not fully govern. How he died depends entirely on which version you accept, and the variety of the versions tells you something about how much the Greeks cared about getting this particular ending right. In some tellings, Apollo, protective of his sister's sworn virginity, and perhaps also simply protective of his twin, in the way that those who share an origin sometimes are, tricked Artemis into shooting Orion herself, pointing her bow at a distant shape in the sea without telling her who it was. In others, Orion is killed by a scorpion sent by Gaia, or by Artemis directly, for some transgression. What all versions agree on is the aftermath. Artemis placed Orion among the stars. He became one of the most recognizable constellations in the night sky. The great hunter, belt of 3 stars, raised forever into the silver domain of the goddess who could not save him, made permanent and luminous in the only space available to her grief. She hunts beneath him still, in the old stories, and sometimes, on very clear nights, when Orion is bright above the dark line of the forest and the moon is out. Her moon, silver and cold and unwavering. You can almost believe that the two things are in conversation, the constellation and the light. The loss, and the one who refuses to forget it. Artemis's most political myth, the one with the longest consequences for the ancient world, involves Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and the Greek fleet gathered at Aulis for the Trojan War. The fleet was ready. The winds were not. The ships sat in the harbor day after day while the army grew restless and provisions dwindled, and no one could explain why the winds refused to come. The prophet Calchas eventually provided the answer. Agamemnon had offended Artemis, killed the sacred deer, or boasted too carelessly about his own hunting prowess, and she had stilled the air in retribution. The winds would not return, the prophet said, until Agamemnon sacrificed his eldest daughter, Iphigenia, on Artemis's altar. What follows is one of the great moral catastrophes of Greek tragedy. Agamemnon sends for his daughter on the pretense of a marriage to Achilles. She comes. She discovers the truth. And she is, in most tellings, sacrificed. The winds return, the fleet sails for Troy, and 10 years of war begin, and the destruction that follows is incalculable. But the myth contains one more detail that tends to be overlooked in the shock of the main event. Some traditions hold that Artemis, at the final moment, replaced Iphigenia with a deer on the altar and transported the girl to Taurus, where she became a priestess in Artemis's own temple. That Artemis, the goddess who had demanded the sacrifice, also prevented it. That she tested Agamemnon's obedience, and then, in a gesture that collapses the distance between severity and mercy, refused to actually accept what she had asked for. The interpretation is not comfortable either way, but it is deeply, characteristically Artemis. She operates by her own logic, and that logic is not always available for human inspection. The wild has its reasons, They are not always ours. She is the protector of young girls in the passage between childhood and adulthood. That fierce, liminal time when a person is no longer what they were, and not yet what they will become. Girls dedicated a year to her service before marriage. They ran in her honor, danced in her honor, hunted symbolically in her forests, and then returned to the cities changed, strengthened, more themselves than they had been when they entered. Artemis gave them something to take back with them, the knowledge that they had existed, briefly, outside the structures that would define most of their lives, that there was a self that belonged only to itself before belonging began. She is still in the forest. She has never left it. She is in every wild thing that has survived, despite everything, in every old-growth tree still standing at the edge of a cleared field, in every river that has not yet been redirected, in every animal moving through the darkness at the edge of your property with its own agenda, its own direction, its own life that has nothing to do with yours, and does not require your acknowledgement to be real. She is the moon on the water. She is the silver light that makes the familiar world strange again. She is moving through the trees right now, just past the edge of what you can see. She is already gone, and the forest closes behind her without a sound. This is worth stating plainly because it is genuinely remarkable. The other gods pursue. They love. They scheme. They hunt. They war. They preside over domains that reflect their natures. But Hephaestus labors. He stands at a forge for hours, days, across the whole long stretch of divine eternity, and he makes things with his hands. He sweats. He plans. He makes mistakes and corrects them, and makes better mistakes and corrects those too, in the patient, iterative way of anyone who has committed to a craft deeply enough to understand that the work is never finished, only abandoned at various stages of completion, in a pantheon full of beings defined by effortless power and unconsidered beauty. Hephaestus is defined by effort, by skill accumulated through practice, by the profound and underrated dignity of making. He is, in this way, the most human of the gods, and he has paid for that humanity in ways that the other Olympians, radiant, unblemished, born perfect into perfect lives, have never had to pay for anything. His origin story is the cruelest in the Olympian catalogue, and it comes in two versions that contradict each other in their details but arrive at the same essential wound. In the first, Hephaestus is the son of Zeus and Hera, born during one of their many conflicts, when a quarrel between his parents escalated to the point of violence. Zeus, in a fury, striking Hera or threatening to, the young Hephaestus intervened. He stepped between them. He took his mother's side. And Zeus, not inclined to tolerate interference from any quarter, seized his son by the ankle and hurled him from Olympus. Hephaestus fell for an entire day. He landed on the island of Lemnos, and the impact broke him. His legs, his body, the whole long arc of his fall ending in the kind of landing that leaves permanent marks. In the second version, the rejection comes earlier and is more intimate. Hera, looking at the infant she had produced, found him ugly, unworthy of Olympus, and she threw him herself, unable to reconcile her divine pride with a child who did not meet her standards of perfection. The baby fell into the sea, where a sea nymph named Thetis, the same Thetis who would one day be mother to Achilles, found him and raised him in her underwater grotto with a gentleness that the mother who bore him had refused to offer. Both stories are painful. Together, they constitute something more than myth. They constitute a portrait of a life shaped from the very beginning by rejection, by the message delivered before the child was old enough to understand it, that he was not enough, that the world that should have been his home had looked at him and turned away. What Hephaestus built from that wound is one of the great transformations in all of mythology. He went to the forge, he learned the fire, he learned the metals, bronze and gold and iron, and the divine substances that have no earthly name, the materials available only to those who work at the intersection of craft and divinity. He learned what the hammer could ask of heated metal, and what it could not, and how to tell the difference. He worked in the volcanic depths of the earth, in caverns lit by the furnaces he had built, attended by automatons of his own construction, golden mechanical women who could speak and think and assist in the work, the world's first robots, forged by the world's first genius of the made object. And then, when he was ready, he sent his mother a gift, a golden throne, more beautiful than anything on Olympus, perfectly proportioned, exquisitely decorated, warm to the touch in the way that only the finest metalwork manages to be, as though the material had retained some memory of the fire that shaped it. Hera received it with the delight that beautiful things reliably produce, and sat in it, and found that she could not rise. Invisible bonds, woven into the throne's construction with a subtlety that no other craftsman in creation could have managed, held her fast. The queen of Olympus, the most powerful goddess in the sky, sat imprisoned in a chair. The gods tried everything: negotiation, commands, the direct application of divine force. The throne was Hephaestus's work, and nothing they could do touched it. Only its maker could release her. The standoff lasted until Dionysus, the most persuasive of the Olympians in the specific register of loosening resolve, went to find Hephaestus and convinced him to return to Olympus. He came on a donkey, reportedly somewhat the worse for the wine that Dionysus had employed as a diplomatic instrument, and he returned to the mountain that had expelled him and stood before his mother and the assembled gods. And he released the throne. What he received in return for his return, what was negotiated in the back corridors of that divine summit, was legitimacy. A place at the table, a forge on Olympus itself, where the smoke of his work would rise among the clouds, where the ring of his hammer would be audible to the gods who had never once considered what it cost to be made to feel unwelcome in your own home. He came back, but he did not come back grateful. He came back on his own terms, as someone who had proven, with a precision that left no room for argument, that he was indispensable, that Olympus needed what only he could make. It is, perhaps, the most honest victory in all of Greek mythology. The catalogue of things Hephaestus made reads like the inventory of a world. He made the palaces of the Olympians, those golden halls on the summit of the mountain where the gods lived and feasted and argued. He made the armor of Achilles, the divine shield whose surface depicted the entire known world in miniature, cities at war and cities at peace, vineyards and wedding processions, and the wide circle of ocean at the edge of everything. Homer describes the shield's creation over nearly 100 lines, with a patience and a reverence that suggests he understood he was describing something that mattered. Not just a piece of armor, an act of art. A world contained within a world, made by hands that understood both the technical and the transcendent possibilities of the craft. He made the thunderbolts of Zeus, the trident of Poseidon, the chariot of Helios that carried the sun across the sky, the golden automata that moved through his forge, the invisible net he constructed to catch Ares and Aphrodite. He made, perhaps most significantly, the first woman. Pandora, which means all gifts, was built by Hephaestus on Zeus's instruction, shaped from earth and water, given gifts by all the gods, beauty from Aphrodite, speech from Hermes, skill in weaving from Athena. Hephaestus made her body with the same care he gave to everything else that left his forge, which is to say, with absolute devotion to the integrity of the form. His marriage to Aphrodite is the great comic tragedy of Olympus, and it illuminates both of them in ways that simple summary cannot quite capture. The most beautiful goddess in creation, love itself, desire made divine, was given in marriage to the god least celebrated for his physical appearance. The limp he carried from his fall, the soot-darkened skin of someone who lives beside fire, the roughened hands of a craftsman, set these beside Aphrodite's impossible radiance. And the mismatch seems almost deliberately unkind. Aphrodite did not remain faithful. She took Ares, the war god, beautiful and violent, and in every physical sense Hephaestus's opposite, as her lover, and their affair was the worst-kept secret on Olympus. Hephaestus, who was not stupid and had never been stupid, eventually learned of it. And he responded, the way he always responded to a problem. He went to the forge, and he thought, and he made something, an invisible net of bronze links, so fine they could not be seen, so strong they could not be broken, strung across the bed where the lovers met. When Ares and Aphrodite came together next, the net fell, and Hephaestus called the other gods to witness what he had caught. The gods who came found it, several ancient sources admit. Quite funny. Hermes reportedly said that no net would make him refuse a night with Aphrodite. Hephaestus released them eventually. He gained nothing lasting from the confrontation except the knowledge that everyone now knew. He returned to his forge. The fire was still there. The metal was waiting. The work, as always, continued. There is a reason the Greeks placed a craftsman among the 12. Every civilization eventually arrives at the same truth, that the made object is not inferior to the natural one, that a chair is as real as a tree, that a city is as alive as a forest in its way, that the transformation of raw material into something useful, something beautiful, something that carries intention and meaning, and the trace of a particular human hand, that this transformation is not merely practical. It is, at its highest expression, a sacred act. Hephaestus is the god of that sacredness, of the moment when skill and attention and patience combine to produce something that did not exist before and could not have existed without the specific intelligence that made it. He is the patron of every person who has ever stood before a blank material, stone, metal, cloth, wood, language itself, and understood that the work ahead would be difficult and slow and worth it. He is not beautiful. He has never been beautiful in the easy Olympian sense, but everything that comes from his hands is, and in the end, when you are standing before something extraordinary, something made with such complete mastery that it stops you in your tracks and takes your breath and makes the world feel, for a moment, larger than it did before. You do not think about who made it. You simply stand there receiving it. The way the gods stood before the shield of Achilles, the way we still stand, in museums and galleries and ancient temples, before the things that the hands of the past made and left us, still warm somehow, from the fire that shaped them. Hermes, messenger of the gods, guide of souls, divine patron of travelers, thieves, and eloquent liars. He was born at dawn, which was fitting, because he spent the entirety of his divine existence in transition, between one thing and another, between one place and another, between what is true and what is merely useful. Dawn is the hinge of the day, the moment that is neither night nor morning, and Hermes is the god of hinges, of thresholds, of the space between defined states where anything, briefly, is possible. His mother was Maya, a daughter of the Titan Atlas, one of the Pleiades, those 7 sisters who carry their grief and their beauty in the night sky. She lived quietly in a cave on Mount Cyllene in Arcadia, and Zeus visited her there in secret, and Hermes was the result. He was born at dawn, wrapped in swaddling, placed in his cradle, and by midday he had crawled out, found a tortoise crossing the cave entrance, killed it, strung its shell with cattle gut, invented the lyre, and composed a song about his own birth that was, by his own evaluation, very good. By evening he had stolen Apollo's cattle. By the time the sun rose on his first full day of existence, Hermes had committed theft, created an art form, displayed a complete and cheerful absence of remorse, and talked his way out of the consequences with such skill that the aggrieved party walked away convinced the whole affair had somehow been to his advantage. He was 1 day old. The gods had absolutely no idea what they were dealing with. His domains accumulate in a way that initially seems random but reveals, on reflection, a deep and organizing logic. He is the messenger of the gods, the divine courier, who carries communications between Olympus and the world below, between gods and mortals, between the living and the dead. He is the patron of travelers and roads, of boundaries and their crossings. He is the god of commerce, of the exchange of goods, of the negotiation of prices, of the handshake that seals a deal. He is the patron of thieves, of heralds, of athletes, of shepherds. He is the guide of souls, the psychopomp, the one who escorts the newly dead from the world of the living to the banks of the river Styx, who moves between realms of existence as easily as most beings move between rooms. What all of these domains share is movement, transaction, the moment of passage between one state and another. Hermes governs everywhere that things flow, information, goods, people, souls. He is not a god of destinations. He is the god of the journey between them, and of everything that happens in transit. This is why he is also the god of language itself, of eloquence, of the persuasive word placed in exactly the right moment. Language is the original transaction. It is the movement of meaning from one mind to another, across the impossibly private distance between two separate consciousnesses. Every time we succeed in making ourselves understood, we have performed a small hermetic miracle. The word hermeneutics, the science of interpretation, the art of understanding what a text or a speech or a gesture actually means, comes directly from his name. He is the god of meaning, making itself. His staff, the caduceus, 2 serpents wound around a winged rod, is one of the most recognized symbols in the world. It began as an ordinary staff given to him by Apollo in exchange for the lyre, that original, joyful transaction that established the template for all commerce to come. In Hermes' hands, the staff acquired properties over time. It could put people to sleep or wake them, could lull monsters into docility, could part crowds and open roads. He guided Perseus through the approach to Medusa, providing the intelligence and the equipment that allowed a mortal to survive an encounter that should have ended him. He rescued Odysseus from Circe's enchantment, appearing to him on the road to her palace with a small white flower called moly and the tactical information necessary to avoid transformation into a pig. He carried infant Dionysus to safety when Zeus needed the child hidden from Hera's fury. He delivered messages that altered the fates of heroes, cities, entire civilizations, always arriving at precisely the necessary moment, always with that quality of having known what was needed before anyone thought to ask. He is the great connector of mythology, the through line, the figure who appears in other gods' stories, with a consistency that no other Olympian matches. Because the other gods have domains, they preside over from a distance, and Hermes has roads. His role as psychopomp, guide of the dead, is perhaps the least expected of his many functions, and the most tender. When a soul left its body, it did not immediately find its own way to the underworld. The newly dead were, in the Greek understanding, somewhat lost, still close to the world they had known, not yet oriented toward what came next. And it was Hermes who came for them, not as a figure of terror, not a reaper, not a judge, but as a guide, someone to walk beside them down the long road that descended from the world of light into the kingdom of Hades. Someone who knew the way and could make the transition, if not comfortable, at least companioned. This function illuminates the deeper meaning of his patronage of travelers. Every road, in the Greek imagination, was potentially a road that ended. Every journey contained within it the shadow of the longest journey. And Hermes, who walked all roads without preference or fear, who moved between the living and the dead with the same easy competence he brought to everything else, was the god who made that shadow slightly less frightening, who said implicitly, by his very existence, the road to what comes next is still a road, and roads can be walked. Small statues of Hermes, called Herms, stood at crossroads and doorways throughout the ancient Greek world. Not elaborate temples, not grand sanctuaries. Simple squared pillars with his image at the top, placed at exactly the moments of transition in a journey, the point where one road becomes another, the threshold between inside and outside, the boundary between known and unknown. They were markers. They were reminders that Hermes was present at every crossing, that no transition happened entirely without divine witness, that the moment of passage, however small, however ordinary, was sacred. He does not hold a grudge. This is perhaps his most unusual characteristic among the Olympians, who tend to carry their grievances with the persistence of geological formations. Hermes lives too completely in the present tense for grudges to take hold. By the time the punishment is over, he is already thinking about what comes next, already moving, already on the road to somewhere that needs him. He is with us more completely, perhaps, than any other Olympian, every time a message travels from one person to another, across the room, across the world, across the strange borderless distances of the modern age. Hermes is in the transmission. Every time a deal is struck, every time a boundary is crossed, every time a story is told with just enough embellishment to make the truth more bearable, every time a traveler arrives somewhere they have never been and finds, to their relief, that the road was navigable after all. He has been there. He is in the network, in the signal, in the moment when meaning leaves one mind and arrives, perhaps slightly altered by the distance, in another. He is in the joke that diffuses an argument, in the lie told with kindness, in the truth delivered sideways because sideways was the only angle that could land without breaking something, in the word found at precisely the right moment that opens what seemed like a closed door. He tips his traveler's hat, that small, private smile, and he is already somewhere else, already in motion, already gone. Ares, god of war, lord of battle, the undisguised face of violence. Ares is the least loved of the Olympians. This is not a modern assessment. It is ancient and deliberate and encoded into every myth that features him. The Greeks who built him were not confused about what they were doing. They did not create a war god they admired. They created one they recognized, which is a considerably more honest and considerably more unsettling thing to do. He is the son of Zeus and Hera, which makes him the only major Olympian born of their union, the one legitimate child of the divine marriage at the center of the pantheon. And yet neither parent has much use for him. Zeus tells him plainly in the Iliad that he is the most hateful of the gods, that if he were not his son, he would have dispatched him to Tartarus long ago. Hera, who fiercely protects most of her children, does not notably protect Ares from this assessment. He is acknowledged. He is permitted his seat on Olympus. He is not, by any account, cherished. The Greeks worshipped him because war existed and had to be accounted for. But they did not love what he represented. They loved what Athena represented. The war that is fought with intelligence, with discipline, with a defined objective, and the wisdom to know when negotiation is preferable to combat. Ares represented something else entirely, something they knew from direct and repeated experience to be real and true and utterly indifferent to their preferences, war as it actually is, rather than as we would like it to be. His physical presence in the myths is overwhelming and deliberately excessive. He is enormous. He moves through the battlefield, filling it. His war cry, Homer tells us, is like the shout of 10,000 men. His armor blazes. He is, in the purely visual, purely visceral sense, everything that the idea of martial terror wants to be when it takes form. He does not plan. He does not strategize. He arrives where violence is occurring, and he adds himself to it, and the violence increases proportionally, and the dead accumulate on both sides with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of a force that has not been given any particular allegiance, only an appetite. His companions on the battlefield are his sister Eris, the goddess of discord, and their children Demos, which means terror, and Phobos, which means fear, not glory, not honor, not even victory. His constant companions are the emotional textures of combat itself, the fear that lives in the body before the fighting begins, and the terror that arrives with it. He drives his chariot flanked by the feelings that the actual experience of battle produces in actual human bodies, because Ares, unlike his more presentable colleagues on Olympus, does not curate what he represents. He does not show you only the noble parts. There are no noble parts, he would tell you, if Ares were the kind of god who explained himself. There is only what happens when two groups of people decide that the question between them cannot be resolved any other way. His humiliations in the myths are numerous and specifically chosen. He is wounded twice in the Iliad, once by Diomedes, a mortal, assisted by Athena, and once by Athena herself, striking him with a boulder. Both times he falls with a crash that shakes the earth and screams in a way that Homer describes, with considerable economy, as the scream of 9,000 or 10,000 men. Both times he retreats to Olympus to complain to Zeus, who receives his complaints with the tepid sympathy of someone managing a necessary but difficult employee. Both times he returns to the field because he cannot stay away from it, because the field is the only place he belongs. He is caught in the net of Hephaestus with Aphrodite, exposed before the assembled gods, and the laughter that greets his humiliation is specifically noted as belonging to the whole company of Olympians. He is defeated by Heracles not once but twice. He is imprisoned by the twin giants, Otus and Ephialtes, stuffed into a bronze jar and left there for 13 months until Hermes found him and released him, half mad with the containment. He loses, reliably, whenever he encounters Athena, despite the fact that he is theoretically the god of war, and she is theoretically the god of wisdom, which suggests something about what the Greeks believed actually won wars in the end. This pattern of defeat is not accidental, and it is not comedy for its own sake. It is a sustained mythological argument. The Greeks were making a case, through every one of these stories, that raw martial force is ultimately subordinate to intelligence, that the battle frenzy of Ares, for all its terrible power, can be outmaneuvered, outwitted, outweighted. They were also being honest about something else, that even when Ares loses, the war continues, that defeating him in a particular engagement does not end the appetite for violence. He retreats, screaming, to Olympus, and within days he is back on the field. He cannot be permanently defeated because he is not a personality or a strategy. He is a condition of human existence. His relationship with Aphrodite is the most genuinely compelling thing about him, and it deserves more attention than the comedic framing of the Hephaestus myth tends to allow it. They are the great unlikely pair of Olympus. She is everything that war destroys: beauty, pleasure, the soft geometries of desire and connection. He is everything that beauty fears, and yet they find each other repeatedly across the whole length of Greek mythology, with a constancy that suggests something more than mutual convenience. She humanizes him, slightly. In her presence, the myths allow Ares a tenderness that appears nowhere else in his character, a protectiveness, a vulnerability, a willingness to be something other than the engine of destruction he is on the field. Their children together are, by some accounts, among the most powerful figures in mythology. Eros, love as a force, as a power that aims its arrows without asking permission, is in some traditions their son, born from the union of war and desire, which is itself a profound mythological observation about the nature of passion. Harmony, the principle of things being in right relation to one another, is also their daughter. The goddess of harmony, born from the coupling of violence and beauty, as though the Greeks understood that balance does not emerge from the peaceful and the moderate, but from the tension between extremes that have learned to exist alongside each other without destroying what they love. Perhaps the most important thing the Greeks built into Ares is his relationship to human choice. He does not start wars, he attends them. He is drawn to violence, the way fire is drawn to oxygen. He does not create the conditions. He simply arrives when they are met. The decision to go to war, in Greek myth as in Greek history, is always a human decision. Ares shows up after the choice is made. He does not make it. This is the most subtle and most important thing about him. He is not a cause. He is a consequence. He is what the world produces when its inhabitants reach the end of their patience, their resources, their willingness to find another way. He is the shape that unresolved conflict takes when it finally runs out of room. He is not evil, in the moral sense that the word carries now. He is honest, in a way that most of his Olympian colleagues are not. He does not dress up what he represents in the language of glory or divine purpose, or civilizational necessity. He simply is what he is, the god of the fact of war, stripped of every justification, standing in the smoke with blood on his armor, and Deimos and Phobos at either shoulder, and the field behind him littered with the cost. Look at him clearly, the myths say. Do not look away. Understand what this is, and what it costs, and what it produces, which is more of itself, always more of itself. And then, having looked, having truly seen, make better choices than the ones that called him here. Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and desire. The sweetest danger on Olympus. She did not have a childhood. This alone sets her apart from the other Olympians, almost all of whom were born in the recognizable way. Born to parents, raised somewhere, shaped by an origin that left its marks on who they became. Aphrodite arrived fully formed, fully herself, from the sea. Her birth is one of the most extraordinary images in all of Greek mythology, and it is extraordinary precisely because it has no precedent and no explanation. It simply happens at the intersection of violence and the deep water. And then she is there, the Titan Kronos, in the act of overthrowing his father Ouranos, cast the severed parts of the sky god into the sea. The sea, ancient, generative, churning with forces that predate the Olympians entirely, received them, and from the white foam that gathered and spread and moved toward the island of Cyprus, Aphrodite stepped onto the shore. The Greek word for sea foam is aphros, and her name carries it. She is the foam-born, the one who emerged not from a womb, but from the intersection of primordial violence and the salt water that covers most of the world. Botticelli painted her arrival 1500 years after the Greeks stopped believing in her, and the image he made is still so arresting, so luminous with what it understands about beauty and vulnerability and the strangeness of arrival, that it has never once stopped being reproduced. She stands on the shell. The wind blows her hair. She has just appeared in the world. and the world is already organizing itself around her presence, already trying to be worthy of being looked at by her. This is what Aphrodite does. She arrives and things rearrange themselves. She is older than the Olympians, in the sense that her birth preceded the arrangement of the divine family on the mountain. She is older than Zeus's authority, and older than the Titan War, and older, some traditions suggest, than the current organization of the cosmos itself. The primordial force she represents, desire, the magnetic pull between beings, the impulse toward union that drives not just human behavior, but the behavior of atoms and planets and everything in between, was not invented by Greek mythology. It was simply named. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE, describes Eros, in his earliest form, before he became Aphrodite's son or companion, as one of the first things to exist after chaos. Love, or desire, or the force that causes separate things to move toward each other, was there at the beginning, before the gods, before the world had its current shape. Aphrodite is the personification of something that predates her own birth, which gives her a depth and a weight that her more cheerful iconography sometimes obscures. There are two Aphrodites in ancient Greek thought, and the distinction matters. The philosopher Plato, in his Symposium, separates them explicitly: Aphrodite Urania, heavenly Aphrodite, the goddess of elevated spiritual transcendent love, and Aphrodite Pandemos, common Aphrodite, the goddess of earthly, physical, embodied desire. The two are not in conflict. They are the same force operating at different registers of the human experience, the same note played in different octaves. But the distinction was important to the Greeks because they understood, with their characteristic and sometimes uncomfortable honesty, that love is not one thing. It is a spectrum of experiences that share a family resemblance while being otherwise enormously varied in their nature, their intensity, and their consequences. What unifies all of Aphrodite's domains is the loss of a certain kind of self-possession, the moment of falling. And it is always a falling, in every language, in every culture, in every century, is the moment when the controlling, deliberating self steps back and something older and less manageable takes the wheel. The Greeks did not celebrate this unconditionally. They observed it with the attention you give to something powerful, that you must live alongside without being destroyed by. Her love for the mortal Adonis is the myth that reveals her most completely. Adonis grew into a young man of such remarkable beauty that Aphrodite herself was arrested by the sight of him in a way she had spent eternity arranging in others and had never quite experienced herself. She loved him, genuinely, unreservedly, in the way that the force she represented had always moved through others, but rarely through her. She spent her days with him in the meadows, abandoning the trappings of divinity, the golden chariot, the retinue, the elevated remove of the Olympian, to walk with him through the ordinary world like a mortal woman. She gave up the altitude of godhood for the ground-level reality of being with someone she loved, and in doing so became, briefly, something closer to human than any Olympian except, perhaps, Demeter in her grief had ever allowed themselves to be. She asked him only one thing: do not hunt the dangerous animals, stay safe. He didn't listen. He found a great boar, whether sent by Ares in jealousy, or by Artemis in retribution, or simply the random violence of a world that does not arrange itself around what we need from it. And the boar killed him in a meadow. And Aphrodite arrived too late, and found him dying in the grass and held him while the warmth left him. The way every person who has ever lost someone too soon has felt the world become suddenly and permanently different. From his blood she made the anemone flower, red, brief, wind-shaken, gone almost as soon as it arrives. The flowers of grief, the flowers of beautiful things that do not stay. Her power over the other gods was complete and acknowledged and, by several of them, bitterly resented. Athena, Artemis, and Hestia were immune to her influence. The three virgin goddesses, who had chosen a different relationship with desire, were exempt from her domain by divine compact. Everyone else was subject to it, including gods who would very much have preferred otherwise. Zeus himself, mightiest of the Olympians, fell under her influence so regularly that entire catalogues of his loves read like a testament to Aphrodite's sovereignty over the King of Heaven. She could extend this power deliberately. Her enchanted girdle, the Kestos Hemas, was the concentrated distillation of her influence into a physical object. Hera borrowed it to seduce Zeus during the Trojan War, and Zeus, who had been on the field managing cosmic alliances and refusing to favor the Greeks, became entirely distracted by his wife for long enough that the tide of the battle shifted. The most powerful being in creation, temporarily rendered incompetent by love, by a borrowed piece of divine clothing. This is the argument Aphrodite makes in every myth about the nature of power, that the force she represents does not recognize the hierarchies that other power respects, that it does not care about thrones or thunderbolts or the careful precedence of divine rank. It finds its way past all of that, the way water finds its way past stone, not by force, but by patience and the simple, relentless fact of its nature. The judgment of Paris gave Aphrodite the role that triggered the greatest war in Greek mythology, and she played it with a directness that leaves no room for misunderstanding about what she thought her offer was worth. Three goddesses. One golden apple inscribed for the fairest, thrown by Eris into the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis to cause exactly the chaos it caused. Hera offered Paris power, kingdoms, dominion over men. Athena offered him wisdom and the skill in battle that wins wars. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. He chose Aphrodite. He chose Helen. And Troy burned. It is possible to read this as an indictment of Paris, his frivolity, his inability to think beyond personal desire to political consequence. But it is also possible, sitting with it long enough, to read it differently. Paris was offered what Hera and Athena represented: power and intelligence, the great engines of civilization and conquest. And he chose instead what Aphrodite represented: love, or the desire for it, or the beautiful, irrational hope that the world might arrange itself around the thing you most want. He chose badly, by most measures, and he chose humanly by all of them. She stepped from the sea fully formed, and she has never stopped arriving. She is in every room where two people notice each other across whatever distance separates them and feel the world reorganize itself around that noticing. She is in the vertigo of falling, in the reaching, in the unbearable sweetness of the moment before everything changes. She is the foam on the wave that has already broken. She is the reason the wave broke at all. Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and theatre. The last Olympian, the twice-born. He is the last to take his seat among the 12. And this is not incidental. Dionysus is the youngest of the Olympians, the newcomer, the latecomer, the one who arrived after the hierarchy was already established and claimed a place at the table, not by birthright, but by something more difficult and more interesting to prove. He brought with him something the other Olympians did not have, something they could not quite categorize, something that made the established order of the mountain simultaneously uncomfortable and unable to turn him away. He brought transformation, the kind that cannot be planned for, the kind that moves through a person like weather and leaves them different on the other side. His birth is the most dramatic of all the Olympian nativity stories, and in a catalogue that includes being swallowed whole, emerging from a skull, and stepping from the sea foam, that is considerable competition. His mother was Semele, a mortal princess of Thebes, and Zeus loved her with the particular intensity he reserved for those whose mortality made the connection both urgent and fragile. But Hera, as always, was watching, and Hera, with the patient devastatingness of someone who has had eternity to develop her methods, came to Semele in disguise and planted a seed of doubt. A god, the disguised Hera suggested, would appear in his full divine glory. How could Semele know this was really Zeus, and not some elaborate deception, unless she asked him to reveal himself as he truly was? Semele, young and trusting and not yet acquainted with the specific danger of receiving divine advice from strangers, asked. Zeus, bound by an oath he had sworn before she made the request, could not refuse. He appeared before her in his true form, the full, unmediated reality of the sky god, lightning and thunder and light that was not organized for mortal perception. Semele burned. The house burned. Everything burned. But Zeus, moving through the fire with the urgency of someone who cannot undo what is happening, but can perhaps limit the damage, retrieved the unborn child from the ashes and sewed him into his own thigh, where he continued to develop until he was ready to be born. Dionysus emerged from his father's body, fully divine, having lost one mortal parent to the fire and been carried to term by the king of the gods himself. He is called the twice-born, born once in fire and loss, and once in the body of his father. He arrived in the world already acquainted with the two experiences that define human existence more completely than any others: catastrophic loss and unexpected continuation. He knows, from his own beginning, that the two can coexist, that the fire and the survival of the fire are not opposites. They are the same story told across two chapters. His Thyasus, the retinue that follows him through the myths, is unlike any other divine company in Greek mythology, where Artemis travels with her ordered company of sworn nymphs, and Apollo leads the disciplined chorus of the Muses. Dionysus moves through the world accompanied by the Maenads, women whose very name means the raving ones, and the Satyrs, those half-goat, half-human creatures of primal appetite, and Silenus the old, perpetually drunk, paradoxically wise figure who is his tutor and companion. His procession is not orderly. It is not quiet. It fills whatever space it enters completely, with music and movement, and the dissolution of boundaries between what you thought you were and what you are capable of becoming when the careful layers of social self fall away. The Maenads are the most extreme expression of his power. These are ordinary women, wives, mothers, daughters, who, in the grip of Dionysiac ecstasy, abandon their domestic lives entirely and pour into the wilderness, dancing and crying and hunting with their bare hands and receiving visions that the sober world cannot produce. The myths treat this with genuine ambivalence. There is terror in the descriptions. There is also something that functions like liberation. The image of women who spend their entire social existence in carefully bounded roles, suddenly moving through the mountains without boundaries at all, accountable to nothing but the rhythm and the god. Dionysus does not force this on anyone. The myths are clear about this. He offers the experience. He holds open the door. Who walks through it, and what they encounter on the other side is their own. The myth of King Pentheus of Thebes is the darkest and most complete statement of what happens to those who refuse him. Pentheus was a young king, orderly, rational, committed to the maintenance of civic structure, and deeply suspicious of the foreign cult that had arrived in his city with its noise and its irrationality, and its dissolving of the categories he depended on to govern. He tried to imprison Dionysus. The prison could not hold him. The walls fell, the chains fell, the fire. Pentheus started to destroy the god's following, extinguished itself. He tried to spy on the Maenads on the mountain, disguising himself in women's clothing at Dionysus's suggestion, climbing into a tree to watch. His own mother, Agave, in the full grip of divine madness, did not recognize him. She saw a lion, and she and the Maenads tore him apart. The tragedy of Pentheus which Euripides dramatized in the Bacchae with such sustained and brilliant unease that the play has never stopped disturbing audiences in the 2,500 years since it was written, is not simply about the danger of hubris, though it is about that. It is about the danger of refusing to acknowledge the reality of forces that exist whether you acknowledge them or not. Pentheus does not believe in Dionysus. He considers the god's influence a collective madness, a social problem to be managed, and the god demonstrates with horrifying patience that what cannot be integrated will simply override, that the wild, ecstatic, boundary-dissolving experience Dionysus represents will happen with or without the permission of the rational mind. It is better, the myth argues, to welcome it consciously, to have some relationship with the irrational parts of existence than to pretend they are not there until they come looking for you in the dark. He is the god of theatre. This is among his most important and most enduring gifts to civilization, the great dramatic festivals of Athens, the city Dionysia, at which the tragedies and comedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes were performed, were held in his honor. The theatre was his sacred space. The mask which actors wore to become characters other than themselves was his domain. The entire act of theatrical performance, the standing before an audience and speaking the words of someone else, of entering another self, while the audience watches both the actor and the character simultaneously, is an act of controlled Dionysiac transformation. He is in the suspension of disbelief. In the moment when an audience of thousands agrees, collectively and voluntarily, to accept a fiction as real for the duration of its telling. In the catharsis Aristotle described, that experience of having your own deepest feelings mirrored back to you through a story, and being moved by it, and leaving the theatre changed in some way that you cannot entirely explain. Theatre is the domesticated, socially agreed upon version of the Maenatic experience. It is transformation with seats. Every playwright, every director, every actor who has ever stood in the dark before the curtain rises and felt something shift in the quality of the air. That is Dionysus. That is his oldest magic, refined and structured and made available to everyone in the audience, not just the chosen, not just the initiated. He democratized ecstasy. He gave it a stage and a schedule, and it worked. It still works. It has never stopped working. He went to the underworld at the end of his mythology's arc and brought back his mother Semele, she who had burned, who had been consumed by the full reality of divine love, who had died at the intersection of a mortal's longing and an immortal's truth. Dionysus descended to Hades and negotiated her return. He came back to Olympus with her, and she was given the name Thyone, and she took her place among the immortals, and her son, the twice-born, the wanderer, the god who had been mad and found his way back to sense, sat at last among the 12. He had traveled the world to get there. He had been driven from his mind and returned to it. He had lost his mother before he knew her and gotten her back. He had descended into the place of the dead and found his way out again. He had died, in some traditions. The Orphic mysteries describe the Dionysus who was killed and dismembered and reborn in a cycle of death and return that predates the Olympian mythology and runs underneath it like a deep current, connecting the god of wine to the grapevine itself, which is cut back every year to nothing and rises in spring with the same impossible abundance as if the cutting never happened. He knows what it is to be lost and returned, to be broken and reassembled, to descend and rise again. This is his final and greatest gift, not the wine, which is only the vehicle, not the ecstasy, which is only the method, but the knowledge, embodied, lived, paid for. That dissolution is not destruction, that the self that comes apart in the dark comes back different, and that different is not lesser, that what survives the fire was always the part that mattered most. Final segment, the legacy of the 12. What the gods left behind. Every civilization that has ever existed has looked up. Not all of them at the same mountain, not all of them with the same names, the same stories, the same cast of divine characters arranged in their family structures of love and grievance and unresolved tension, but all of them. Every human community that has left enough of itself behind to be examined has looked at the sky and at the sea and at the earth that feeds them and the darkness that frightens them, and has asked the same questions in different languages. What is this? Who is responsible? And what does it want from me? The Greeks asked those questions with a particular genius, not the genius of the answer. They did not, in the end, have the answers any more than we do, but the genius of the question itself, of the method of asking. They looked at the full complexity of the world, its beauty and its cruelty, its order and its chaos, its love and its violence, and they refused to simplify it. They refused to say that the universe was governed by something entirely good because the evidence did not support it. They refused to say it was governed by something entirely cruel because that did not match the experience either. They said, it is governed by something that contains all of it. Something that is powerful and flawed and passionate and occasionally catastrophic and capable, in its best moments, of genuine magnificence. They made it a family, because a family is the oldest and most honest model we have for the coexistence of love and conflict, of loyalty and betrayal, of the impossibility of living together and the equal impossibility of living apart. The 12 Olympians have not left us. They have changed address several times. They shed their temples and their sacrificial altars and their formal worship gradually across the long centuries of the early Christian era, as the Roman Empire changed its official religion and the old sites were repurposed, and the last Eleusinian mysteries were celebrated in the 4th century CE, and then stopped. They went somewhere, the gods, not away, somewhere adjacent, into the imagination, which is the most resilient temple in the history of religion because it requires no maintenance and cannot be demolished. They are in our language in ways so complete we have stopped noticing them. The days of the week carry them. Dies Martis, dies Mercurii, dies Jovis, dies Veneris, all their Roman names embedded in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, the names worn smooth by 2,000 years of daily use until they feel like our own invention. The planets carry them still, those wandering lights that the ancients watched with such sustained attention: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, moving through the sky with the names of gods who are still, in some sense, moving with them. The months carry them, the constellations, the flowers, hyacinth and anemone and narcissus, that grew from divine grief and wear that grief still in their common names. The words carry them: panic from Pan, music from the Muses, ocean from Oceanus, volcano from Vulcan, cereal from Ceres, aphrodisiac from Aphrodite. We speak the gods every day without knowing it. They live in our mouths. They live in our institutions too, in ways that run deeper than language. The courthouse with its columns is the Parthenon's descendant, and it is Athena's argument that justice requires architecture, that the structure of the law deserves a building that says this matters, made in stone again and again across the Western world. The hospital bears the caduceus, or the rod of Asclepius at its entrance, the snake wound symbol of healing that comes directly from the divine medical tradition of Apollo and his son. The library, with its accumulated knowledge arranged for public access, is a hermetic institution, the god of information made permanent and available. The theater, everywhere it exists, is Dionysus's house. The Olympic Games bear the name of the mountain. Every 4 years, athletes from across the world gather to compete in a tradition so old that its origin was already mythological to the Greeks who first organized it. A tribute, they believed, to Zeus himself. We have stripped the religion away and kept the competition, the ceremony, the flame that is carried from Olympia across the world to the host city. The flame of Prometheus, stolen from the gods and given to humanity, still burning, still passing from hand to hand. What the 12 Olympians gave us, more than any specific institution or word or inherited symbol, is a way of thinking about the human condition that has never been entirely superseded. They gave us the understanding that power and wisdom are not the same thing, and that a world governed by power alone, by Ares, by the thunderbolt without the owl beside it, is a world that will destroy itself. They gave us the understanding that intelligence without compassion, Athena without Demeter, strategy without the acknowledgement of what it costs, the people caught inside it, is insufficient. They gave us the understanding that desire is not weakness, and that love, however dangerous, is not an error, that the body's hungers and the heart's longings are not failures of rationality, but expressions of something real and important about what we are. They gave us the understanding that grief changes the world. Demeter proved it. The seasons know that the loss of what we love is not a private matter. It has consequences, it reaches outward, it changes the temperature of everything, and that return is possible. Not unchanged, never unchanged, but possible. They gave us the smith's dignity, the reminder that the made thing is sacred, that the person who makes, who labors, who transforms raw material into something that did not exist before, is doing something the gods themselves do, and that this deserves to be recognized. They gave us, in Dionysus, permission to be undone occasionally, to lose the careful shape of ourselves and find, in the losing, something truer than the shape we maintain for public consumption. The understanding that the rational mind is not the whole of what we are, and that the parts of us that resist categorization are not the parts to be ashamed of, but the parts that contain, if approached with any courage at all, the deepest truths we will ever access about ourselves. They gave us, most of all, the mirror, not a flattering mirror, not a mirror that shows you what you want to see, that softens the difficult parts and amplifies the impressive ones. A clear mirror, a mirror in which the divine is as capable of pettiness as the mortal, in which the most powerful beings in creation are also the most susceptible to love, to jealousy, to grief, to the particular madness of caring about something you cannot control. A mirror in which the gap between intention and consequence is as wide for gods as it is for us, in which knowing the future, as Apollo does not make you immune to loss, in which being the goddess of love, as Aphrodite is, does not protect you from heartbreak. The Greeks built their gods in our image, which sounds like a limitation and is actually the most generous thing they could have done. They said, "The divine is not alien to you. It is not cold or remote or entirely beyond comprehension. It is made of the same materials you are made of, moved by the same forces, subject to the same essential condition of existing in a world that will not organize itself entirely around what you need from it. You are not separate from the divine. You are its nearest relation." The mountain is quiet. The 12 are at their table, in whatever form they now inhabit. In language, in institution, in the stories we still tell, in the questions we still ask, when the thunder arrives and the sea turns dark and the harvest fails, and we fall in love with someone who will not love us back the same way, and we grieve, and we make things with our hands, and we light fires in the darkness, and we look up. They are there when we look up. They have always been there, not because the mountain is real in the literal sense, but because what the mountain represents. The human conviction that there is meaning in the storm, pattern in the chaos, intention in the turning of the seasons and the movement of the stars, and that we are somehow part of it, is as real as anything we have ever known. Mount Olympus is still there. On certain mornings, The clouds still gather around its summit, and the peak disappears, and the mountain becomes a mountain with a mystery at its top. And somewhere below, a person looks up and feels something ancient stir in them, something that was there before the first story was told, something that will be there long after the last one ends. The clouds close, the mountain holds its secret, and the world, ancient and endlessly renewed, turns quietly toward morning.